Well, good morning. It is good to be here with you again this morning because we have another great story to be looking at again today. Today we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. Yay! See what you started? We are going to be looking at this book, and it is an amazing, God writes an amazing story, doesn't he? It's just, I love these stories because this book is a book that is full of courage and fear, of inspiration and of brokenness, of kings and of peasants, of power trips and of submission, of assassination plots and of rescue, of loyalty and of betrayal and of shadow missions and of purity in heart. Like all of this wrapped into this one story of Esther. Esther, at its core, is a story about confronting difficult things. It's about confronting hard things. And it's about confronting hard things on a number of levels. It's about confronting hard situations, but it's also about confronting the difficult truths when we look deep inside and who we are inside. Confronting the truth of what lies inside each of us. The truth about our motives and our temptations and where we naturally default to when our selfishness goes a little unchecked. It's full of characters that some would call, have what some would call a shadow mission. And a shadow mission is the thing that I aspire to when I drift on autopilot. The attitudes and the activities that kind of take over when I allow my personal agenda and my own selfishness to lead. It's a book about all of this. And so I think about confrontation and the confrontation of this book, and it reminds me of this story that I heard, true story, that I heard one time about a man who needed to face something difficult. There was a confrontation that he needed to walk into, and he was really nervous about walking into this confrontation. And so he's talking to his wife about this thing that he needed to do, and he's all nervous about it. And he says, well, when I think about needing to go talk to this person, like my palms get sweaty, and I think about the words that I need to say, and my mouth gets dry. And his wife, being full of compassion and a very pragmatic woman, looks at him and says, well, if your palms get sweaty and your mouth gets dry, how about you just lick your palms? So this is a story about Esther who licks her palms. So we're going to begin Esther chapter 1. We can't go through it verse by verse like we did with Ruth because there's just too much. We'll be here really long and none of us wants that. So, but you can follow along in your Bible because we're going to take kind of section by section in Esther, and you could follow along through the book of Esther as we go through it this morning. So here we go. Chapter 1. So context, again, the nation of Israel is in exile. It has fallen, the Jews are in exile, and it's under Persian rule, okay? So that's the context. And the story starts with a guy named King Xerxes. And he is a man of indulgence. He is a man of excess. His kingdom includes 127 different provinces that stretch from what would be modern-day India to Africa. And Xerxes is the kind of guy that instead of using his influence and his power wisely, he is a shallow, silly little king. And apparently he is the kind of king that likes a party. This is the thing that Xerxes enjoys. He likes a party. And at the beginning of the book of Esther, the king is hosting a 6-month party. 6 months. Opulent, excessive, indulgent party for 6 months. It says in Esther chapter 1, verse 4, that it was a tremendous display of opulent wealth, because this is what drives Xerxes. He likes to show off. He wants a party. He wants everybody to know that I've got all this stuff. And after that 6-month party, he decides to throw a second, just measly little 7-day party, kind of an after party for his servants and his officials that kind of put up with his big 6-month party. And even the after party is crazy opulent. It says in Esther chapter 1, verse 5, when the main party, was over, the king gave a special banquet for all the palace officials and servants. The courtyard was decorated with beautifully woven white and blue linen hangings, fastened by purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in the marble pillars, gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. This is the after party. This is like the party after the main party. Can you even imagine the decadence of this man and this rule? So at this after party, everyone is half drunk or merry with wine, as some versions of scripture say. And Xerxes decides, I want to show off a little bit more than I already have. And when you want to show off, what do? You drag out your greatest possession, the thing that you think everybody's going to be most enviable of, correct? And so what does he want to drag out? His greatest possession that he also wants to show control over, Vashti, the queen. He wants to drag her out so he can show all of his guests. This is kind of crude, but he wants to show all of his guests what a hot wife he has. That's his objective. He wants them all to come out and see her. It says in verse 11, he wanted all the men to gaze at her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. So he wants to prove that he's got a beautiful wife that everyone should envy and that he has control over this beautiful wife. So he's like, Vashti, come on out. I want you to parade before us so that my guests can ogle at you. Just gross, right? And Vashti says, thank you very much for the ever so appealing offer, but I think I'll take a hard pass on that because I would rather pour lemon juice over an open wound than to come parade in front of your guests. Not exactly the response that Xerxes was hoping for. And the king is furious because Vashti is making him look bad, like he can't control his woman. And this is a problem because in verse 18, it says, he's gathering kind of his advisors around him, and they say, before this day is out, the wife of every one of us, your officials throughout the empire, will hear about what the queen did, and will start talking to their husbands in the same way. There will be no end to the contempt and the anger throughout the realm. They're like, oh no, if Vashti can do this to the queen, our wives are going to start usurping our authority in our household as well. It will be the end of our male supremacy. What shall we do? And so what they decide the appropriate response to this is to ban Vashti from ever seeing the king again, which to me is a little bit of an ironic punishment because I kind of don't think she was sad. I kind of don't think that she's like, oh no, I don't get to go walk before all your guests so they can look at me in lustful ways. Like, blah. Of course she's not sad about that. But this was the punishment. And then chapter 1 ends with the king sending letters. This is chapter 1, verse 21, sending letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in his own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his home. So he's even sending out notices to the kingdom now, like, okay, just don't forget, even though Vashti did this thing, don't forget, every man, you're the man. Like, don't forget, sending out the decree. That's how chapter 1 ends. We open chapter 2. Well, here we are now. Xerxes is in a bit of predicament, right? Because he is a king without a queen because he has sent Vashti away. And we've learned that his greatest value in a queen is one that looks good on parade, right? So what do you think he's looking for in the next queen? Of course, he's looking for a woman who's beautiful, and he wants a woman who is a virgin. That's what he and his advisors kind of like gathered around and decided. Again, like gross, what the heck? But anyway, that's what they decide. So they're going to find this new queen, and she needs to be beautiful, and so he wants every province to send in their most beautiful woman. Remember, he's got 127 different provinces. All of these women will ultimately become a part of his harem, but there's only one that's going to be declared queen. And so he brings these women in, and all 127 of them vie for the attention of this one man. It's like this little competition where all of the women gather, and it's a competition, and one man ends up choosing in the end. Sound familiar at all? It's like The Bachelor. Oh my word. We thought The Bachelor was kind of like this weird new thing that our culture did recently. Xerxes started The Bachelor way back in the day. What a stupid way to pick a wife, right? But anyway, Esther is one of the women. She's chosen from her province as the woman to represent her province. Now, Esther is a Jew. Her Hebrew name, her given Hebrew name is Hadassah. But she was told by her cousin Mordecai, who raised her because she was an orphan girl. She was orphaned as a child, and she was raised by her cousin Mordecai. And Mordecai was like, just use your Persian name. Use Esther. Don't let them know that you are of Jewish descent. And so Esther participates. She just kind of like is the good girl, and she participates in the 12 months of beauty treatments. 12 months getting these women all that perfect to see the king. And she is sent in for her turn after 12 months to see the king. And the king decides that Esther is the one. In chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved her more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther is now queen. And it looks like she's destined to simply live out her life as the beautiful and compliant queen. Under the radar. Let's keep it slow and steady, right? In the meantime, Mordecai, her cousin, the one that had kind of acted as a dad to her, worked at the palace. And Mordecai overheard this plot to assassinate the king. And so he brings it to the attention of the people that he needs to bring it to the attention whatever word I want there. He brings it to the attention of the appropriate parties, and the assassination attempt is thwarted, and nothing else really happens at that point about this whole scenario, but it does get recorded in the king's personal journal. He has this journal book that he writes in that are all of the cool and interesting things that I have done or experienced as king. I'm going to write them all down in this book about me, which is all duly recorded according to chapter 2, verse 22, recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. We'll set that little tidbit aside, put a pin in that part right now. It'll come into play again later, but that's where chapter 2 ends. So then we open chapter 3. So there's another guy who enters kind of stage right into the story. We're almost done introducing new characters. I know it can be a lot to keep up with. But there's this guy who enters this story at this point, and his name is Haman. And Haman is the prime minister of the kingdom. So he's second in command. And he's not like the silly little king. Haman is smart. Haman is cunning. And Haman is irrationally egocentric, which makes him really dangerous. He is a dangerous guy because he's smart, cunning, and so self-focused. Haman is obsessed with power, and lots of it. And whenever he walks by, he wants people to bow down to him and tremble. He wants them to be afraid of him. That's his greatest desire. Now the problem is that when Haman walks by Mordecai's no, not playing that game with you. I bow only to my God. I'm not bowing to you, so I'm not going to bow down. And this makes Haman, according to chapter 3, verse 5, he was filled with rage. Irrational, blinding, red. If this would be a cartoon thing, it would be when the thing blows off the top of his head, what? That kind of rage and anger. And so Haman decides, not just this guy's going to pay, but all of his people are going to pay for this level of disrespect. In chapter 3, verse 6, it says, so he decided, it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Since he had learned that Mordecai was a Jew, he decided to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So essentially, Haman goes to the king and he says, hey, king, there's a group of people in the empire that aren't playing by my rules, and I would like to wipe them out. I will pay you money for the privilege of writing a decree that wipes them out. I will pay you. There is an exchange of money for the privilege of writing this rule. That is this decree that is going to annihilate all the Jews. And the king, who's just, like I said, what's his big concern? Party. I don't think that'll interfere with my party, right? So go ahead, do whatever you want. Write your decree, Haman. And so Haman writes a decree, and he picks a day on which all of the Jews will be slaughtered. And that's recorded in chapter 3, verse 12. On April 17th, Haman called in the king's secretaries and dictated letters to the princes, the governors of the respective provinces, and the local officials of each province in their own scripts and languages. These letters were signed in the name of King Xerxes, sealed with his ring, and sent by messengers into all the provinces of the empire. The letters decreed that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen nearly a year later on March 7th. He wants to give enough time so that these letters can get out into all of the provinces and everybody can plan for this day. He wants to make sure that when this job is done, it is done thoroughly, and the Jews will be exterminated. So he gives himself plenty of time to get that word out and for everyone to get ready for this annihilation. And so chapter 3 ends with the planning of a genocide. Chapter 4 opens. Mordecai hears about this decree, and he is devastated. He is like wrecked. He is ruined. And he goes outside the king's gates, and he does the whole mourning, wailing, sackcloth, ashes, all of that outside the king's gate. And as other Jews learn about this decree that has been put into place, they start joining him at the palace gates. Now, what we need to understand, though, is that this was not just like we feel bad for ourselves, so we're going to gather together and comfort each other in our time of distress. What they were doing was actually picketing. They were protesting. That was a form of protest in that time. So for them to be at the palace gates doing what they were doing was similar to picketing the White House, okay? This could get them into trouble. This was like a controversial thing that they were doing. And Esther is in the palace, and she's kind of isolated. Of course, she's only receiving the news that the palace wants her to be able to hear. So she doesn't hear about this decree about the Jews, but word does get to her that Mordecai is out there picketing the king. And so she sends a message out to him. She's like, excuse me, what do you think you're doing? Because you're going to get us all in trouble. Stop it. Knock it off. Don't do what you're doing because you're being dumb. Stop. And Mordecai sends a message back to her. And he explains, look, this is what's going on. This is what's happening. And he says, Esther, there's only one person who can help. There's only one person that has influence here that can make a difference. The beauty queen. The bachelorette. The trophy wife. You are the one. Go to the king, Esther, and plead on our behalf. And Esther says, no way. She says in chapter 4, verse 11, the whole world knows that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him in more than a month. So Esther's saying anyone who comes before the king without being called there just dies unless the king is feeling particularly generous that day, and this guy typically isn't. And what's even more than that is that he has not called for me to come to him in more than 30 days. And what does that mean? That means he's kind of losing interest in her, right? She was a nice, bright, shiny trinket for a while for him, and now he's kind of moving on. She's not as intriguing to him as she once was. And so she's like, that I can't do that, because on top of those circumstances, you also understand, Mordecai, that you're asking me to go in there and tell the king that I don't like the way that he's doing his job. That's what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to defy him openly. That's kind of what got me in this position in the first place, because Vashti kind of did that and it didn't work out so well for her. I can't just go marching in there and tell him that his wife says she doesn't like the job that he's doing. No, not going to do it. But Mordecai sends a message back. Chapter 4, verse 13. Don't think for a moment that you will escape there in the palace when all of the Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance for the Jews will arise from some other place. He's confident in his God. But you and your relatives will die. And what's more, who can say but that you have been elevated to the palace for just such a time as this? Mordecai is basically saying, don't think that you're not going to die anyway. You're worried about dying if you go to the king. Don't think that that's how it's not going to end if you don't go to the king. And maybe, just maybe, you are at the palace for precisely this point in time. You have not been brought to this point in your life to accumulate gems and fragrances. You have not been brought to this point for the reasons that the king thinks that you have been brought to this point in your life. You have been brought to this point in life to work for justice, to advocate for those who are suffering, to oppose a man who is evil and powerful. This is what you've been brought to this time and place for. You have been brought to this time and place for a bigger story, Esther. You have been brought to this point for such a time as this. Now, we know how it ends. And so we know when we hear that little phrase in our own lives today, for such a time as this, it's somewhat inspirational to us, right? We embroider it on our tea towels and print it on our coffee mugs because it feels inspirational and courageous. But imagine how that felt for Esther to hear that message in her context for the first time. It would be thoroughly terrifying, right? For such a time as this, what? I'm supposed to step into what? She's always been the one to fly under the radar, to play it safe, to be compliant. She doesn't want to lead this. She doesn't want to rock the boat. She doesn't want to feel the weight of that responsibility. She's just a girl. Understand, here's a little tidbit for you. Esther was likely about 14 years old when she became queen. This probably happened within about 5 years of her becoming queen. She's most likely under 20 years old. She's just a girl. And she's saying, I don't want that on my shoulders. Can you imagine? Can you relate at all? I know I can. Even as a bona fide grown-up, there are things that I'm like, God, I don't want to lead the charge there. Don't make me step out. And I haven't even had to go before king or anything of the magnitude of Esther, but there have been things that I'm like, God, I'm tired. I don't want to be the one to be an agent of change here. I don't want to shoulder that responsibility. What if I let people down? What if I don't do it well enough? What if what I have to bring to the table isn't sufficient for what's needed here? God, it's easier to do the blend-in thing than to stand out and do the agent of change thing. It feels too hard. It feels too risky. It feels like it's going to cost too much. That's how Esther's feeling. And none of this is her fault. It's not like she has to go in and undo something that was her fault. She didn't mess it up. It's not her fault. But it is her time. It's not her fault, but it is her time. The Jews are slated to be destroyed because essentially the shadow missions of two men are going basically unchecked. And she is the one who has influence with both of them. It is her time. King Xerxes, his shadow mission is just to be consumed with self-indulgence and the appearance of strength and control, that he doesn't really care about what's going on anywhere else as long as his next party isn't in jeopardy, right? Haman's shadow mission is essentially more. That's where he defaults to, more. I want more of everything. I want more wealth. I want more power. I want more respect. I want more control. And anyone who gets in the way of my path to more is met with blinding rage and violence. And then there's Esther. She's in the throes of her own shadow mission, right? She's got stuff too, right? We all default somewhere when we're not guided by a moral compass. Based on her beauty, she has become queen. She has been trained and taught that her value lies in her face and in her body. She has been trained to anticipate every desire of the king and to meet it. I think before I used to think of Esther as probably like a Spitfire personality because of what she ultimately ends up doing. But when you really read her backstory and you really read this scripture, you realize I don't think that was her natural personality. I think she was a very compliant personality naturally. Her default was to keep her head down and to follow directions. That was her default mode. And I suspect it was a bit of a survival skill for this little orphan girl, right? That's probably what kind of kept her safe through the years. But Esther has someone in her life who sees more potential in her than just being a beauty queen. And he challenges her to consider that perhaps her life was intended to be more than just survival. Perhaps her life could change the course of history. You see, Esther had two things that Xerxes and Haman did not. She had a God who gave her a moral compass, and she had a Mordecai in her life who challenged her to pursue something greater than her own mission, to see a story bigger than her own story. And so Esther has a choice to make. Does she shrink back into the shadows? Or does she jump headlong into the big story? What's she going to do? And I think about Esther's decision, and I think, I wonder what my decision would have been, right? What would have we done had we been in this place? And I'm challenged to consider, like, what pattern of action and of thinking would betray my deepest values in this? Would I value my shadow mission more than the bigger picture? What is my shadow mission? Where do I drift when I am on autopilot? And honestly, my shadow mission, left unchecked, is to perform for approval and appearance. Sounds ugly to say it out loud, right? But left to my own, without resetting my moral compass regularly, I perform to make people respect me and to approve of me. I don't care if God is glorified as long as I am. It's ugly when you name it, right? That's the ugly truth of it. And it's sobering to realize how very quickly our lives can slide into such a self-centered pursuit. How quickly autopilot can take over. And then the next thing you know, here's me and here's the world, right? It happens quickly. No one wakes up one day and decides to be Adolf Hitler or Putin, right? No one decides that. But it's a series of consistent choices over time to serve my selfish desires that leads us to that place of destruction. And I think it's the commonplace nature of our shadow missions that make them so entirely possible. I'm wondering this morning if each of us here can name our natural default mode. What is your shadow mission? Is it winning approval? Is it abdicating responsibility? Is it accumulating more of anything? Is it being desperate to be loved by someone, anyone? Is it finding value in the other things that surround you? Is it using a God-given ability to glorify yourself? Whatever your vice is, you know it's your shadow mission when you are the only player that matters in that game. And at the end of the day, everyone's shadow mission is about themselves. And you can see it when you look, truly look, at the way that you interact with other people and respond to other people. Is this about me? Or is this about something bigger? So how do we stay on target? How do we keep our shadow mission from hijacking our life? Well, first of all, we have to be honest about it. We need to name it. Be honest about what it is. Be honest about what you default to left on your own if your moral compass isn't set straight. If you don't name it, you know what you're going to do? You're going to excuse it. Name it. Secondly, get a Mordecai in your life. Someone that you have given permission to, someone that loves you, that you trust, that you have given permission to call you out on it. If they see that your choices are getting a little myopic and self-centered. And lastly, and probably the most important, spend time with God every day, asking him to reset your moral compass so that you are pursuing a life that's about something bigger than your own agenda. Spend time with God asking him to give you perspective on who we are and who he is and how we relate to one another. Because what that does is it takes us out of the middle of the story and puts God's story as central. So here we are at Esther's moment of decision. Mordecai is telling her, Esther, it is time to be a part of God's bigger story. And Esther's saying, but my palms are sweaty and my mouth is dry. And Mordecai's like, Esther, you lick your palms. Lick your palms. And she does. She goes to Mordecai and she says, gather the Jews, have them fast and pray. She knows she needs power. She needs wisdom. Have the Jews fast and pray for 3 days. And then, chapter 4, verse 16, the second half, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I am willing to die. If I perish, I perish. But Esther says, I'm going to do the right thing, even though it could cost me everything. Close chapter 4. Chapter 5. So Esther gets all dressed up in her royal robes, and she goes unsummoned to see the king. Now imagine the scene for a moment. Esther puts on her very best regalia, and she's walking through the palace, and she's going through the hallways on the way to the throne room. And can you imagine the whispers starting? Because they know that she's going to the throne room, and they know the king hasn't called her. What's going to happen? The whispers, the wondering, this like literal life or death drama that's starting to play out in front of her. And I can just imagine like Esther walking, head held high, one foot in front of the other, deep breaths, heart pounding, eyes forward. Here we go. It's all or nothing. And she opens the door to the king, and she bows, and he rises. It's the moment. It's the moment of life or death for both Esther and for a nation. And the king extends his scepter. She lives, at least for now. She lives. And not only that, those days of fasting and prayer didn't go unnoticed because the king is also feeling somewhat generous that day. And he asks her in chapter 5, verse 3, what do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? Because he knows like, this was no light thing for her to come before him. But what is your request? I'll give it to you. Even if it's up to half the kingdom. Now, he doesn't really mean that he's going to give her up to half the kingdom. That's really kind of king speak for, I'm feeling kind of generous today, and if you're asking for the remote control for the evening, I might give that to you. He doesn't really mean he's going to give her half the kingdom. It's just like, I'm generous today. Bask in my generosity. Now, Esther is more than just a pretty face. She's not stupid. And she knows full well that she can't just blurt out to him like, hey, what I want is that you made a really stupid agreement with Haman, and I would like you to take that back. Can you rescind that? Can you just do what your wife says and reverse that thing? And by the way, I'm a Jew. She's not going to just blurt that out, right? Because she's not dumb. So instead, she decides, I need to butter up the king. I need to make him feel good about giving me what I would like. I need to find the right moment, and this is not it right now. And so she says, I'm going to have a party, and I want you and Haman to come. Chapter 5, verse 7. This is my request and deepest wish. If your majesty is pleased with me and wants to grant my request, please come with Haman tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for you. Then tomorrow explain what this is all about. So, of course, Mr. Animal House is like more than happy. A party? Sure. I'll come to your party. You're putting on a party? Let's go. And at her party, again, wine is flowing, spirits are high, and the king asks her again, what do you want, Esther? Even up to half the kingdom. Just tell me what you want. And again, Esther's like, nope, it's not quite time yet. You know what I want? I want you to come to another party. And I'll tell you at that party what it is that I really want. But we're having so much fun tonight. Let's do this again at my next party. King's like, a follow-up party. I know all about these. Let's go. Follow-up party. So, of course, the king responds. Now, Haman is also a super happy camper in all this, right? Because he's being invited to special parties, private parties by the queen. Can't get more important than that, right? He's got the world by the tail. And as he's leaving that first banquet, he sees Mordecai. And what's Mordecai doing? Mordecai's sitting. He's not even shaking. He's not trembling. He's not afraid. He just thinks I'm an ordinary person. And he is furious. He cannot take it anymore. Chapter 5, verse 9. What a happy man Haman was as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, he was furious. However, he restrained himself. Deep breath. Gonna go on home. And then he gathered his friends and Jersh his wife and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other officials and leaders. And Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to a banquet she prepared for all of us. She has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. And then he added, but all of this is meaningless as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting at the palace gate. I have all of these things, all of this stuff, and this one man is destroying all of it. Ironically, you see how much power he's giving to Mordecai? He's given a lot of power to Mordecai, that one man can destroy all of these things is driving him literally to insane level rage. Which, note to self, when we start pointing to external excuses for internal turmoil, we're pointing in the wrong direction. All that swirling that Haman's going through, that's an inside problem, not an out there problem. Mordecai is not the problem. The stuff inside of Haman, that's the problem. And it's time to do a little self-reflection when we find ourselves in that place, when we're pointing out there saying, oh, all that is responsible for this thing that I've got inside of me. It's time for a little self-reflection when we get in that place. But unfortunately, self-reflection is not Haman's strong suit. So instead of self-reflecting, he has a gallows built, 75-foot gallows. And he's like, I'm going to the king tomorrow, and I'm not waiting until March 7th when this whole planned thing is scheduled to be done. I'm asking the king tomorrow if I can put Mordecai on that gallows once and for all. I'm getting rid of that man. Close chapter 5. Chapter 6. So it just so happens that night the king had trouble sleeping. And so he calls his servants to him and says, will you read to me? And of course the book he wants read to him is the book of the history of King Xerxes. So essentially this is, I'm having trouble sleeping. I want someone to read to me. What's my favorite book? Oh, the book that's all about me. Would you read to me the book that's all about me? I would like that one tonight because that's soothing to me when I get to read all about me. If this guy isn't a narcissist, I don't know who is. But the servant is reading the book about me to Xerxes as he's trying to get to sleep. And he reads the part about the time that Mordecai foiled the assassination plot. And the king is kind of fascinated by this story. He's like, wait a second. I forgot about that. Did we ever do anything for that guy? And the servant's like, nope, doesn't look like it. The king's like, I think maybe we need to do something about that, because he's thinking, we want people to know they're going to be rewarded if they help me, right? We should. So around that time, Haman shows up. And the king is still pondering this whole Mordecai thing. And he's like, Haman, what should I do for a guy that I want to honor? What's Haman thinking? Who else would the king want to honor except for me? I am the man. So Haman's like, oh, I get to get all the things that I want here. You know, it's kind of like the stage whisper, like, who else would the king want to honor except me? And so Haman's like, well, here's what I think. I think you should put your royal robe on this guy. And then I think you should put him on your royal horse. And then we should decorate the horse, make it all like as fancy as we can get it. And then what you need to do for this guy that you wish to honor, wink, wink, is you need to have a nobleman take that horse through the city and have that nobleman pronounce to the entire city, this man is amazing. He is the one that the king wishes to honor. That's what you should do for the man. And Xerxes says, chapter 6, verse 10, excellent. The king said to Haman, hurry and get the robe and my horse and do just as you have said. And Haman's like, all right. For Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the palace gate, in case there was any lack of clarity about which Mordecai we were talking about, and do not fail to carry out everything that you have suggested. So the king said, I want to honor Mordecai. Haman, you pull the horse. The irony of it all. Anyone who says that scripture is boring clearly has not truly read it, because that is hilarious to me. And thousands of years later, we can still feel the seething through the pages, right? Because he is mad. And Mordecai is given his victory lap through the city, courtesy of Haman. And now it's time for Esther's second banquet as we close chapter 6. Chapter 7. So here we are at Esther's party number 2. And the king is all fat and happy. And he asks Esther again, what is it that you want? And Esther cuts to the chase. She tells the king that my people and I have been sold to be slaughtered. And remember that up until this point, the king doesn't know that Esther's a Jew. So she's like laying it all out here. Like it's all on the line for Esther at this point. This is the if I perish, I perish moment for her. But the king is furious. Like, who would hurt you and your people? You can read about that. Chapter 7, verses 3 to 8. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you, my queen? Esther replied, this wicked Haman, the one right here, he is our enemy and our adversary. And Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. And then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Just leave it. I'm so angry. I just can't even stay here right now. Now Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with the Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In his despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. So Haman, in all of his things are falling apart, unraveling. I'm not used to this unraveling feeling. And he throws himself on Esther, and the king comes back, and what does he think? The king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. So even the attendants were like, sorry, Haman. End of the line right here. They know what's coming. They're covering his face because we don't like to look into the eyes of a dead man. They cover his face. And someone mentions that Haman had just had a 75-foot gallows built, and the king says, that'll do. String him up. And the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai become the gallows that Haman dies on. Chapter 8. So Haman is dead. They got to do something with all the stuff that he's acquired over the years, right? And so the king assigns it to Esther, who in turn puts Mordecai over the estate of Haman, which all of that wealth and all of that power that Haman had worked so desperately to create now ends up in the hands of the man that he most despised. There's like some poetic justice there, right? Unfortunately, there's still no justice for the Jews because that decree, that's still in place. And you don't just undo that necessarily. And so Esther goes back to the king again. I think we kind of miss this. Like we know about that first time when she goes to the king and if I perish, I perish. We don't realize she did it a second time. Like not just once, but twice. Esther goes unsummoned to the king. Twice. He could have just said, I'm done. You've created a lot of fuss for me, lady. Done. But she goes back again, this time falling down in front of him, crying and begging for him to stop Haman's plan. And again, the king holds out his scepter. And the king, who we've decided isn't exactly the wisest, or maybe not even the brightest pencil or bulb in the pack, whatever, sharpest pencil in the pack, king's like, okay, here's my ring, write whatever you want to write to undo that. Like, here, you just take responsibility. Just write a thing that will undo what was done before. And so Mordecai writes a new edict that allows the Jews to mount a defense on the day that is intended to be their day of slaughter. In chapter 9, verse 1 says, and on that day, which was the day that the Jews were supposed to be executed, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to destroy them, but quite the opposite happened. The entire tide turns. You can read about the details of all of that if you would like to later, but the tide turns and God's people win. What a story. An unlikely story, right? God's story is often unlikely. You see, the story of Esther is set at a time when Israel looked like they were all alone. They were in exile. They had no temple to go worship in. There was no Jerusalem. They were alone. And did you realize, a little scholarly tidbit for you here, that Esther is the only book in the Bible where the name of God does not appear. It is not written in the book. The name of God is not written in the book of Esther. It's the only book in the Bible where the name of God is not written. But he's there. Not only is he there, he's still the main character of the story. Because there is a thread of an unalterable truth that runs through this story. There is a thread of the hand of God always turning, the thread of the story that is being woven. Because how else could it be that of all the women in the kingdom, this beautiful little Jewish girl is the one who becomes queen? And how could it otherwise be that of all the men in the kingdom and all the people that wander about in the palace, that it was Mordecai, her cousin, who was the one that heard the assassination plot? And otherwise, how could it be on the same night that Haman has the gallows built is the same night that the king gets insomnia? And how could it be that of all of the little tidbits about the kingdom that the king has written down in the book about me, the part that gets read to him that night is the part about Mordecai the Jew? So many pieces that cannot be explained in any other way but by the presence of God's story, God's thread, God's unalterable truth being written into this story. And the writer wants us to know that even in exile, even when God seems silent, even when it feels like we can't find him, even when his name is not spoken, he is there. He is always there. And he is inviting us into his bigger story. If only we get beyond ourselves enough to see the story. If only we stop tripping ourselves up with our shadow missions and pursuits of these myopic little self-serving stories. Maybe it's our time. Maybe there are things that are happening in your life that are not your fault, but it's your time. It's your time to step in with grace, to step in with integrity, to step in with a mind to the bigger picture and not just your own agenda in it. Maybe it's your time for such a time as this. Maybe it's your time to love the people in your life, to seek justice in the things that have somehow woven their way into your story, even if it costs you something. Maybe it's your time. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you for always being present, even when we can't see you. Thank you for always weaving a bigger story, so much bigger than we could have hoped for or imagined. Give us eyes to see it, to see that story and the courage to just step into it in the way that you are asking us to. We are humbled that you would choose us to be a part of that grand story for such a time as this. Amen.